Our history is no more than a series of incredible events. Every one of us can influence its course. From the birth of a 1,000-year-old empire to the death of a flourishing civilization. From the creative genius of a handful of men to a worldwide cultural revolution. From the darkest of totalitarian visions to the most horrific of great wars. From the heroic resistance of an entire people to the iron determination of a minority. The most infinitesimal of our decisions can influence the future of humanity. To know the past is to foresee the future. 2035, the Aral Sea oasis, Central Asia. Dubbed the miracle of the desert, the region is now a haven of green in the middle of one of the most arid zones of the globe. For the whole world, this is the proof that sustainable development does work. In the mid-20th century, the Soviet Union decided to turn this remote and hostile region into an experimental laboratory. After decades of development, advanced irrigation techniques made it possible to exploit the very last drop of water and revolutionize agriculture. Today, the Aral Sea oasis is an example to humanity and is a shop window for sustainable development. But none of this ever happened. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union was to launch a major agricultural project in this region and seal the fate of the Aral Sea. In 1954, the Soviet Union launches a project of pharaonic proportions, the construction of the Great Karakum Canal. 2002, a specialist American team goes to a secret laboratory and destroys 300 tons of bacteriological material. 2003, in an attempt to save the threatened Aral Sea, they build a huge concrete dike in its northern part. These three events are the tragic steps in one of the biggest ecological disasters of the 20th century, the death of the Aral Sea. As these words are being written, robots made by humans are moving across the surface of the planet Mars. Millions of miles from Earth, they were designed and sent by men with a precise aim: discover traces of water. Why is this so important? Because, given our current state of knowledge, liquid water is the main condition for the presence of life. Our planet is called the blue planet. Water covers 71% of its surface. Of this gigantic mass, only 2.5% is fresh water. The majority of this is trapped in glaciers and the polar ice caps. So of all the water present on Earth, only 0.5% is accessible and potentially drinkable for all living creatures on the planet. Not much, but enough. The reserves of fresh water should be sufficient to provide all with the means to survive without difficulty. However, it so happens that these reserves are very unequally spread across the surface of the globe. 9 countries share 60% of the world's reserves of fresh water. These reserves are the water table, the lakes, and the rivers. Often they extend over several countries. The Nile, for example, crosses 8 different states before flowing into the sea. The question of who owns the water is at the heart of international relations. With the explosion of the world's population and climate change, access to fresh water has become an issue of global proportions. In the years ahead, this could turn into one of the principal causes of international tensions, as is currently the case in Central Asia, in the region of the Aral Sea.
Welcome to the memory of humanity. Here we can control time, analyze and compare billions of events and alter them to rewrite history endlessly. All the events in our history, however minute they might be, are memorized and interconnected. It only requires one to be changed for all the others to be shaken to the core. For example, let us go back 10,000 years to witness the birth of the Aral Sea. The Earth has just emerged from the Ice Age. The warmer climate melts the ice, the rains are increasingly heavy. The water flows, streams form, and then rivers. In Central Asia, the Sea Daria swells and starts to fill a depression, which means a vast plain that is lower than the surrounding land. Gradually, a freshwater lake is formed. Very soon, the waters of the Amu Darya also contribute to the flow. The lake reaches its maximum size 2,000 years later and pours its excess waters into the Caspian Sea. However, this is a fragile lake, not very deep. Evaporation is high. Over the following thousands of years, it experiences its highs and lows and progressively becomes salty. Today, we call it the Aral Sea, but scientifically, it is really a salt lake. The water has turned an arid desert into a veritable oasis. Let's resume.
Nature is a free and abundant resource that can be controlled and exploited. Such is the slogan of the leaders of the Soviet Union. A union of several republics, the Soviet Union is a federation. And at the beginning of the 1950s, its aim is clear. Make up its economic lag on the Western capitalist societies. On all fronts, in all regions, they produce, build, extract, exploit, harvest. Their objectives, set by Moscow, are always ambitious, sometimes unattainable. Production is regionalized. This region is responsible for mineral extraction, that for steel, another for tractor production. Historical and natural boundaries now only exist on paper. Populations, like the wealth beneath the ground, are considered as resources and reviewed on the map. In Moscow, they decide on vast plans for territorial development and rationalization of resources. Human and environmental factors are of secondary importance. Everybody contributes to the collective effort. To oppose it is to oppose the forward march of the regime. Industry and exploitation reach formidable sizes, commensurate with the country. Resources are in proportion. In 1919, the Soviet Union selects the Fergana Valley in Central Asia to launch its cotton offensive. Planting soon spreads to 3 Soviet republics, then to 5. Even though dry, this region becomes a vast cotton field to the detriment of wheat, now grown in southern Siberia, another Soviet region. The fields are rapidly collectivized into huge state farms, the sovkhozes. In the 1950s, huge canals are constructed to irrigate these vast fields. Tons of fertilizers and pesticides are used. They have to produce, always produce more. The cost doesn't matter. In 70 years of Soviet domination, Central Asia goes from a production of several 100,000 tons to 9 million tons of cotton. An increase of 1,200%. To achieve this incredible figure, it was necessary to irrigate a desert. Millions of cubic meters of water are taken from the Sea Daria and the Amu Darya, the 2 rivers that have always fed the Aral Sea. This decision, taken in full awareness by the Soviet leaders, signed the death warrant of the Aral Sea.
We have just reached a turning point. A turning point is a key event, a crossroads in our history, where the world swings one way or the other. The Soviet leaders, aware of the consequences, decide to sacrifice the Aral Sea, which is considered as a useless resource. This decision is taken without any consideration for local populations living directly off the sea, such as the fishermen in the towns on the shores. But it also represents a way of thinking. Nature is a resource. It has to be useful. However, the Aral Sea is seen by Soviet leaders as an aberration. Not very deep, and therefore spread wide, its evaporation is high. All this water is considered as lost. This is to misunderstand the complex mechanisms that govern the climate, because this water necessarily falls as rain somewhere else, feeding another ecosystem. Today we know this. Nature's balance is complex, and you cannot alter one element without disturbing another. It's a domino effect. By opting for cotton, Moscow signs the Aral Sea's death warrant.
At the beginning of the 1940s, the Aral Sea has an average surface area of 67,000 square kilometers, which makes it the fourth largest lake in the world. Fishing vessels come and go. Fish abound. Gradually, cotton production is intensified. Like all other plants, cotton needs sun and water. The sun may be abundant in Central Asia, but water must be provided by irrigation. However, intensive irrigation creates salinization of the soils, which become sterile. The more you irrigate, the poorer the soils become, and the more you must find others. It's a headlong race. And so, they build larger irrigation canals, which divert more water. In 1954, construction is begun on the Karakum Canal. At 1,375 kilometers long, it remains one of the longest irrigation canals in the world today. Taking 11 cubic kilometers of water from the Amu Darya each year, it carries it across the Karakum Desert as far as the Caspian Sea. All along its course, it irrigates vast fields of cotton. A very rudimentary construction, it leaks at least 30% of its water, which is lost into the desert. Along the two rivers, they divert the water, dig canals, build dams, reservoirs. By the time they reach the Aral Sea, their flow is considerably diminished. Between 1960 and 1970, the level of the sea drops by an average of 20 centimeters per year. In the following decade, the average rises to 50 centimeters. Wells start to dry up. Boats are stranded. In 1975, the increasingly sterile soils demand ever higher uses of fertilizers and pesticides. The port of Aralsk, having no water, is closed. In 1980, the construction of the highest dam in the world is completed on the course of the Amu Darya. The sea level drops by more than 80 centimeters per year. Totally paradoxically, it is planned to replenish the Aral Sea by diverting major Siberian rivers. They dig navigation canals in the seabed to allow ships to sail. Around 1987, the level reaches a critical point and the sea is cut into two. To the north, the lesser Aral Sea. To the south, the greater. In 1991, the Soviet Union breaks up. The 5 republics are now autonomous. Faced with the new economic challenges and deprived of support from Moscow, the cotton industry increases even more. By 1998, the sea has lost 80% of its volume. The remaining water, too saturated with salt, becomes toxic. Fish and weed disappear. By 2003, nothing can now save the greater Aral Sea. However, the lesser, fed by what remains of the Sirdarya, is not yet condemned. They decide to save what they can. A concrete dike 12 kilometers long cuts it off permanently from its big sister. The greater Aral Sea is abandoned and left to its fate. A mere few decades will have been sufficient to reduce it to 10% of its initial surface. Its salt level is over 100 grams per liter, saturated with salt and pesticides. The remaining water is now poison. The greater Aral Sea is in its death throes. By 2020, it will no longer exist. They're already talking of the Aral Desert.
Little by little, drop by drop, a sea has dried up. And yet a sea is vast. The amount of water is incredible. The fish stocks appear inexhaustible. But that is exactly the problem, because this is not the case. Everything comes to an end. Certainly taking one bucket of water from the ocean or killing one whale will not change the balance. However, it's the repetition of the act over decades, thousands of times by millions of individuals that creates the problem. Although some major disasters are obvious, such as Chernobyl, others are less so. Like the hundreds of millions of cars that are driven every day. But both are equally polluting. In environmental matters, each action counts. Let's go back in time. In antiquity, the Roman Empire overexploits the forests of North Africa to the point of causing their disappearance. To our day, they have still not returned. During the Middle Ages, in Europe, the intensive use of blast furnaces threatens the existence of entire forests. Craft and industry have always had to deal with the pollution created by their activities. This is not new, and for our contemporary societies, it has even become normal. But pollution has evolved over time. It is now more massive, more irreversible.
The Soviet Union was a powerful but destructive machine. It managed everything and oversaw the proper division of tasks and resources. When it broke up in the early 90s, after 60 years of supervision, it left the satellite republics to face their problems alone. Far from fixing itself, the situation was to get worse. Whole regions had been specialized in precise fields, making them depend on each other for their essential needs. In Central Asia, the 5 cotton-producing republics rapidly withdrew upon themselves, each looking to its own interest, its own survival. 1/3 of the Uzbekistan economy depends on agriculture. For this, the country freely pumps from the rivers that run through its territory. However, these had their sources in 2 other republics, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. These 2 mountainous countries inherited from the USSR the majority of the region's dams and reservoirs. They also intend to exploit their resources as best they can. They are increasing production of electricity by holding more and more water in their dams. Uzbekistan suffers drought in the summer, floods in the winter. Tensions mount as the levels of the rivers drop. Previously, the Soviet Union acted as interstate policemen. Today, each country wants to achieve economic stability while sharing a single and unique resource: water. It's every man for himself.
the water war. We talk of water shortage or hydric stress when the demand for water exceeds available resources. The Aral Sea region currently fits this definition, but it is far from being the only one. The countries of the Near and Middle East, of Africa and Asia are especially affected by this phenomenon. It often creates tensions, even conflicts between the states concerned. Examples are increasingly numerous. The case of the Dead Sea is emblematic. Its tributary, the Jordan, is shared between Israel, Jordan, and Palestine. Intensively used for the needs of cities and for crop irrigation, it now barely feeds into the Dead Sea, which has lost a third of its surface area over the last 50 years. Water has become one of the main causes of tension between those countries. On the other side of the world, on the west coast of the United States, Nevada is also on the brink of the abyss. Located in the middle of the desert, in an environment totally unsuited to human activity, the city of Las Vegas has 2 million residents and 55 golf courses. An artificial oasis, the city is on a drip feed from the waters of the Colorado. Dubai and Barcelona are equally starved of water. Guaranteeing populations access to drinking water is now a challenge of the first order. And to achieve this, anything goes.
More than 60 million people currently live in the Aral Sea region, 4 times more than in the 1960s. The ecological disaster is slowly turning into a humanitarian disaster. The climate has turned hostile. The winters are harsher, the summers hotter, drier. The Aral Sea is now no more than a vast, sterile expanse, contaminated with millions of tons of salt and pesticides. Dust storms laden with chemical substances sweep the former seabed now laid bare. Neighboring regions are seeing their soils contaminated in turn. Pasture land has shrunk by 80%. Cattle breeding is in full decline. Pesticides are present throughout the food chain. Fishing has almost entirely disappeared through lack of fish and water to sail on. For 5 million inhabitants, drinking water is really no longer drinkable. In some places, the cancer rate is 25 times higher than for the rest of the world. Women suffer from anemia. Infant mortality is soaring. It's now about survival. And yet, the story doesn't end there. In 1936, on the island of Vozrozhdenia, the Soviet Union set up a scientific institution that, in the 1950s, was to become a vast research lab into bacteriological weapons. Thousands of animals will serve as guinea pigs over the decades. Smallpox, leprosy, cholera, bubonic plague, anthrax. At the twilight of the USSR, the lab was closed and the infected material sealed in stainless steel drums, then left there, on an island supposedly inaccessible. Except that in 2001, the island is no longer an island, and so anybody can walk to the lab. Anthrax, free for the first terrorist to come along. In 2002, an American expedition arrives to neutralize 300 tons of pathogenic products. Perhaps the Aral Sea disaster will allow humanity to become aware of its fragility and to be able to draw the necessary lessons from it. But that is another story.
Water is worth its weight in gold. Global warming is now an admitted fact and recognized by the scientific community. For all the regions already in hydric stress, there is no way that things can improve by themselves. We can live without oil, without gas, without gold. But water is the essential minimum for life. For many countries, water will soon become more precious than oil. These countries will have only two options: adapt or seize more water by force. Adapting takes time. Fortunately, the process is already underway. Throughout the world, increasingly ambitious initiatives are seeing the light of day. New irrigation techniques, desalination plants, political commitment. In 2015, the 21st Conference on Climate Change was held in Paris, better known as COP21. Despite the announcement by American President Donald Trump, it cannot be denied that for the first time, the majority of countries managed to agree. It all remains to be done, but it appears that we have finally understood that we all live on the same planet.